Hello, everyone. Welcome back. In this mini lecture, we will be continuing our discussion on how we measure and record behavior. As always, I've outlined 3 objectives. So this week, I would like for you to be able to describe the 3 different types of interval recording procedures. So you will get some more practice using interval recording through the at-home exercise, in which you are coding the behavior of the treadmill video. Second, you will be able to describe both indirect and direct methods of collecting data on challenging behaviors. And you're also going to be able to identify the common functions of challenging behaviors. All right, so with that being said, let's get going. So just to review, we've already introduced data collection last week. So in last week's reading and lecture, I had introduced the idea of permanent products as a form of data collection, so we can assess students' behavior or learning through products that are permanently available to analyze. So these are things like reports, art projects, quizzes, worksheets. So those are called permanent products because they're something that we can use at another time to evaluate a student's performance. A lot of our discussion in our last class session was about direct observation measures. So we had reviewed the different types of measurement systems that we use when we're directly observing behavior. So this could include event recording, rate, latency, duration, and our time sampling or interval recording procedures. And today we're going to focus on anecdotal recording. Okay, so anecdotal recording is the 3rd main type of data collection that is oftentimes used in classroom settings. Alrighty. So I want to talk about anecdotal recording in the context of challenging behaviors, because anecdotal recording actually plays a significant role in our ability to understand the context in which challenging behaviors occur and the situations or factors that might be reinforcing or maintaining the existence of those challenging behaviors. Okay, so I want to give just a little bit of background or context about challenging behaviors and how our approach to addressing challenging behaviors has changed over time. So in the 1960s and 70s is when applied behavior analysis really started to gain some momentum and some popularity. But in its initial stages, most of applied behavior analysts' focus was on the consequences. So again, we see here our 3-term contingency, that with any behavior, there's something that sets the occasion for it to happen, right? So the context somehow elicits behavior or sets the occasion for behavior. The behavior occurs, and then what occurs after determines whether or not that behavior will maintain or increase, right? Or decrease, right? So the consequence determines that. And in the 60s and 70s, we were really focused on the consequences of behavior. And that was really how we were trying to understand the occurrence of behavior, was by focusing primarily on consequences, right? In the 1980s, we started to think a little bit more complex in that we said, well, that behavior happens for a reason, right? Behaviors just don't occur out of the blue. So 1980s was when functional behavior assessment started to take shape. So in functional behavior assessments, it's a type of assessment that we can do to try to make hypotheses as to why that behavior occurs. So what is the function of that behavior and how does it serve the individual who's demonstrating that behavior? Right. The idea is if we can understand why the behavior is happening, we can find an appropriate replacement behavior, right, to teach instead. So that behavior is serving a function, and that function needs to be met. But how can we teach that student to meet that function in a more socially appropriate way? In our understanding of challenging behaviors and through lots of research and study, we generally say that challenging behaviors serves 2 main functions. So challenging behaviors either it gets something for that individual, so they engage in it to obtain something. So it could be obtaining attention, obtaining a tangible, or which is just food or toys, obtaining some kind of sensory stimulation, right, or obtaining control over the situation. Okay, or it can be to escape. So for all of those things, it could be that I want to escape attention, right? I want to escape, an unpreferred activity. I want to get out of, right, an interaction with someone, right? Or maybe I'm experiencing a sensation that I want to get rid of, right? So a lot of times if you think about, if you have a headache, a lot of times people might like put some pressure on those points and it actually relieves the pain for temporarily, right? So the two main functions that challenging behaviors serve is either to obtain something or escape something. In the 1990s, our focus turned to analyzing why behaviors might occur and then manipulating both the antecedents that might set up the behavior, as well as thinking about how the consequences, how we can change around consequences so that we're not maintaining the inappropriate behaviors. So really thinking about how to take a more comprehensive package approach to dealing with challenging behaviors. Okay. And this was kind of the start of what we now know as positive behavior support. So this idea that we can prevent challenging behaviors from occurring in the first place if we have a good understanding about what sets up those challenging behaviors. Now, you all, if you're in the special education program, will take an entire course on positive behavior support. So I will briefly introduce this to you, but just know that you will get more in-depth training and opportunities to learn about these concepts. Right. But for our class, I want to focus mostly on the methods that we use when we're assessing challenging behavior. Let's review some terminology that will come across in your readings and that will come across in our conversations. So FBA stands for Functional Behavior Assessment. And so FBAs are a process of collecting data, and this data will help us figure out when a child is likely to engage in a challenging behavior, and it'll also allow us to make some predictions as to why he is engaging in the challenging behavior. Again, with this idea that people engage in challenging behaviors to obtain something or escape something. If you see the term functional analysis, that is actually when you manipulate variables to understand the behavior. So in functional analysis, we may intentionally put the student in an attention condition in which if they engage in that behavior, they're provided attention, just try to rule out possible functions, right, or factors that might be maintaining that behavior. Functional analyses are typically done in more clinical settings, whereas FBAs are more routinely done in more natural settings like schools. Okay. From your functional analysis or from your functional behavior assessment, you identify the function of the behavior, or you identify a hypothesis for why that student is engaging in the behavior, and you develop what's called a BIP, or a behavior intervention plan. Again, this is linked directly to your functional assessment or your functional behavior assessment. Based on that hypothesis, you develop a plan for how you're going to change around the antecedents to try to prevent the behavior from happening in the first place. And then you outline a specific plan for consequences. So what happens when the student engages in the challenging behavior? How are you going to react, right? How are you going to teach a more appropriate placement behavior, right? So if the student engages in a replacement behavior, what is your plan of action? Okay, so think of the BIP as the plan that the adults are going to follow to try to reduce a behavior or try to treat a behavior. All right. In any functional behavior assessments, the first step is just to observe. So we are observing the behavior in its natural setting. Okay, so we're watching a student in his or her classroom, and we're seeing and taking notes about everything that is happening in that setting. Okay. Again, the goal of the FBA is to, first of all, identify and define what the challenging behavior is, right? That's always our first step. We need to be able to define the target behavior so that we can observe and measure it. Okay. Once we've identified and defined that behavior, we're going to observe the student, right? We're going to observe at times that we're sure we're going to see that challenging behavior. When we see the challenging behavior, we're going to take note of what is going on when this behavior occurs, okay? What is the setting, what is the context, and how do people react, or what happens when the student engages in the behavior? So what are the consequences of engaging in the behavior? Okay. It's also helpful to take note of when the behavior does not occur, so a non-occurrence of the behavior, right? So there'll be times when the student is successful and not engaging in challenging behavior, and that can also be very informative. Right. So with an FBA, we always start with defining the behavior. We start collecting data. I want to talk mostly about direct methods here. All right. Once we get the data collected, you analyze all your data and you formulate your hypothesis as to why that student is engaging in the challenging behavior. Okay. I'm going to go over this quickly, but we've talked a lot about this so far in during our class, right? When we define behaviors, we always want to make sure that we're defining it in observable terms, right? So if we're talking about an action, we need to be able to see it, right? We're going to avoid those mentalizing terms. So we're going to avoid saying like, well, he's frustrated, right? I can't see frustration. I can't see inside his brain to see when he's frustrated. So what I care more about is the physical or visual output of that feeling. So what does it look like when he's frustrated? Now, I mentioned there were both indirect and direct methods. Let's talk about some indirect methods that you will engage in when you're doing a functional behavior assessment. So these might include a review of past records. These are indirect because we're not directly observing the behavior. These are things that can be conducted outside of the moment. Okay, we're going to review the past records because we want to know if there is something that has been tried in the past. So have there been other FBAs in the past? How long has this behavior occurred? Is there any indication of any major events that have happened that might be a potential, what we call setting event for this behavior? Okay. We're going to conduct interviews with people who are close to the individual and have experience and have witnessed the student engaging in the challenging behaviors. And there's also a number of checklists and rating scales that we can use to help inform our decision. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about interviews. For folks who are very familiar with the FBA process, oftentimes they can do what they call a free-form interview, where they just kind of go in and without a clear agenda are able to ask pointed questions and follow up with questions to get at the information they need. Now, most people, especially when they're new at this, will not be successful if they're just doing a free-form interview. But fortunately, there are many structured interviews that are commercially available. One is what we call the functional assessment interview. This is by O'Neill and Horner. It takes around 30 to 90 minutes. Another interview tool is called the Functional Assessment Checklist for Teachers, and it's much quicker. It takes between 10 to 20 minutes. All right. I also mentioned that there are checklists and rating scales that teachers or parents can complete. One of the most common one is called the Motivation Assessment Scale. There's also an assessment called the Problem Behavior Scale or Problem Behavior Questionnaire, and the questions about behavior of function. So for time purposes, I don't want to go into too much detail about each one of these, but I have uploaded examples of these checklists and rating scales on our Canvas site. So after today's talk, I would encourage you to go ahead and just look at those to see what some of the items might look like. All right. Now let's talk about direct methods for data collection. I'm going to talk about two main types of direct methods. First are what we call scatter plots, and then what we call ABC analysis. All right. So a scatter plot is simply trying to identify times during the day that a student is likely to engage in the behavior. Okay, because one of the first things that we need to know is when the child engages in it so that we can directly observe it, right? It's always frustrating when you go into a classroom for the purpose of observing the student and he does not engage in the behavior. So scatter plots kind of help us identify times during the day and when the child is likely to engage in the behavior. right? It also creates a nice visual display that we can start to see patterns. We might notice that, you know what, always after lunch this happens, or first thing in the morning, or during transitions, right? We want to look for patterns. Here's an example of what one scatter plot might look like. So this is just a 45-minute time period. You can have one for the whole day, but essentially it's broken up into 15-minute intervals, and the teacher fills in the box when there's 3 or more occurrences of the behavior. So this behavior is aggression. He's throwing books. So a filled in box means that the student threw 3 or more books. A dash means 1 to 2 books. And a blank means that there were no behaviors shown, right? So this gives you a nice visual of if I needed to come in and observe the behavior, when would I likely see it? Now let's move to ABC analysis. This is the main type of anecdotal recording that is used in functional behavior assessments. Again, in applied behavior analysis, we're really focused on understanding factors and environmental stimuli that set up behavior, as well as factors that might be reinforcing or maintaining the behavior. So this is a simple check, or a simple spreadsheet here where you note down the time the behavior occurs, right? Where you are and who the staff are, because sometimes staff can actually be an antecedent or an SD for behaviors, right? When we see the behavior, we write down exactly what the behavior is. We think about what immediately preceded, right, the behavior. So for instance, the teacher gave the student a direction to sit down. The behavior was he threw a book. Consequence was teacher reprimanded him, right? So we're taking note about antecedent, behavior, consequence. And you do this enough times throughout the day, you might start seeing patterns, right? So you might notice that every single time he engages in the behavior, the teacher gives him attention in the form of reprimanding him, right? Right, so the rules of thumb in general, once you get all your data, so you've collected several days of this anecdotal data, you want to look for patterns, okay? If the behavior tends to happen when demands are in place, you might automatically start to think escape, right? Especially if the student gets out of that task, right? So teacher says, we're in math class, it's time to open up your math workbook. You are working on this page. Student throws a pencil, he gets sent to the principal's office, right? If that happens repeatedly, you might think, well, the function of this behavior might very well be escape, because every time he does it, he gets out of doing math. Yes, technically he's sent to the principal's office, so the teacher's thinking she's punishing the behavior, but she actually might be reinforcing it because she's allowing him to escape, right? So it might be maintained by escape. If the behavior is time to happen when adults are occupied, so oftentimes we might see that kids engage in this behavior when a teacher is working with another student or is teaching a whole class lesson and isn't able to attend directly to that student. We might start to suspect attention, especially if the consequence of engaging in that behavior is that you effectively get that teacher's attention, right? When we're formulating hypothesis, it oftentimes does follow kind of a nice formula similar to our IEP behavioral objectives. So generally, the hypothesis statement looks something like, when this happens, right, student will do this to, and then the function. So for instance, we might say, when a teacher is leading class, student will call out to gain the teacher's attention, okay? And again, the whole purpose of creating the summary statement or this hypothesis is so that we can start to develop a behavior plan to effectively address the triggers of the behavior and the consequences that might be maintaining it, right? Now that was a really, really quick overview of a very complex topic, okay? You will do much more readings, and again, there's an entire class that you will take about this. I just wanted to show you how anecdotal recording in the form of the ABC checklist can help inform, right, our data collection. Right? and how it might be used to better understand behaviors. All right. So for the remainder of your asynchronous activities, you have a chapter that you need to read. You're going to read in your textbook, chapter 5. There's also an article that I posted on Canvas by Erin Barton. We have today's mini lecture. And you, of course, as always, will submit your discussion role and complete your quiz before our class meeting next week. I would also encourage you to start thinking about your assignment 1. At the very least, you have enough knowledge to identify who your person is that you're observing, what the behavior might be. Okay, and again, I am available, and Deidre is also available if you wanted to talk about your behavior and how you're defining it to make sure you're on the right page. Okay? All right, friends, that is all for now. I will see you in our class meeting next week. Bye.